The family is doing very well. Thank you, Bob. It's great to see you, and Louise. Hi, Louise.
I guess.
They may come and interrupt at various points in the day. Bobby is hungry, he's just told me. So he's appeared with bags of chips and apples and bananas. So you may see various small boys and food appear on your screen.
That will be grand, Gus. You know, I'm seeing 10:02, so I think I'd like to go ahead and call the forum to order, please, and greet everyone and say hello. I'm Constance Nestor, and I've had the pleasure of chairing the Scottish American History Forum these last 9 years, and I'd like to wish you all a hearty welcome today. It's wonderful to see all of your faces out there on the big screen. And you know, we're all looking forward to the day when we can be together again in person and take a cup of tea and a freshly baked scone while we celebrate our history and culture. And I don't think, Gus, it should be too terribly long until we can all be together again in our beloved Heritage Hall, hopefully. That's your cue to chime in and say absolutely.
As in the words of Robert Burns, it's coming yet for all that and all that.
All right. Well, just imagine that. We're looking forward to the day. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Hague, I'm just so delighted that Gus Noble has joined us, our president of Caledonia and Chicago Scots. And Gus has agreed to say a few words for us. So Gus, I'd like to call upon you at this point, please.
I just wanted to echo your warm welcome, Connie, and to thank you for doing all that you've done and you do for this community, and to say hello to everybody, to faces I haven't seen for a while, and to those calling from further east, Bob and Louise from the Detroit Scots. It's great to see you again, and I hope all of you guys have been well over there. Members of our board are here. I see Caroline and Dan and Sandy and Judy and Alan and Jennifer. I'm sure I've missed somebody because I only have a certain number of folks on my screen. But I also wanted to thank Euan for reprising some of his talk that he did with Mark Blythe for us in the day following the election. And Euan, I have to say that we've had hundreds and hundreds of views since then from all over the world. So I know that you're going to have probably more to say than you did that day, and I'm really looking forward to it. The election, of course, is a political affair, and as a not-for-profit organisation, we cannot and will not take a view on politics, be they national here in the United States or over in Scotland. But as I did with yourself and Mark on the call we had, the drama and discussion call we had the day after the election, please, I encourage you to speak freely of your own opinions and so on. Everything is well at Caledonia Senior Living. The staff and the residents are doing great. We look forward, all of us, to the days where we can open up our arms and our doors and welcome the world back into us. We will continue to be cautious. We've been guided by caution throughout this crisis, and it's seen us have one of the best records of safety and success in the field of long-term care. And surely the fact that 99% of people have the vaccine in their arms gives us the assurance, the comfort and the confidence that we've done all we can do to the highest and best level to protect physical health. And now our focus shifts to mental health, to social health, to reconnecting families, to spiritual health and emotional health and all those other types of well-being. And just as I have been kind of the mother hen and the mother goose protecting the eggs on the nest for 15 months, I see a change ahead in my role, in my job. And I think that's to lead us back to safety, to lead us back to a normal way of life. And that begins now. We have some in-person events that we're going to do, not at Caledonia, but safely to watch a football match when Scotland triumphs, as surely we will in the European Championships coming up. We're going to host our golf tournament. We're zeroing in on a date and a place for the feast this year. And as I said, it's coming yet for all that we will be together once again. In the meantime, I'm not sure that these types of formats will go away. I've certainly enjoyed my time on Zoom, and as Euan said, it allows us different connections. Bob and Louise from Detroit can join us today, and we had callers from Scotland and Australia watching the drama and discussion that featured Euan and Mark. So I think there'll be an element of this to our events, but surely we look forward to being together again. Thanks, Connie. Great to see everyone.
Oh gosh, Gus, and thank you so much for joining. Absolutely. Once we reconvene at the Heritage Hall, we're planning to record and we're planning to have international Zoom capability. So absolutely, we've got to keep this going and enlarge it. And by the way, Gus, you know, the medical centers that I work at Amita, that we have been given instruction to disassemble all the temporary negative air pressurization rooms. So that's a great sign. That means COVID is pretty much behind us.
I have to say the plan that we wrote, that we're sticking to, is coming to the point where I wrote the phrase "COVID is defeated" in phase.
I love it.
When vaccines become widely available and in a sufficient number of arms. And I feel it's getting to that point. I feel it's turning a corner, and we will, of course, retain all the infection control procedures and protocols that we've put in place, but we're going to make them invisible. I want everybody to have the assurance that they'll be instantly scale upable once again, if ever we need them. But we've got to get back to normal. Everyone needs it.
Hear, 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 hear. Well, you know, Gus, I have said this so many times before, but I'm going to continue to say it, but I just want you to know that we are all so very proud and grateful to you, both you and your entire Caledonia team, for your miraculous success in keeping the residents safe during COVID. So I hope you will please accept our heartfelt gratitude and admiration. Well done. Okay, well, now I believe it's time for us to move forward with our presentation today. We are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Euan Hague, Professor and Director of the School of Public Service at DePaul University. And of course, as you all know, I believe, Euan is one of our very own Chicago Scots Board governors. And Euan is going to speak to us, as Gus alluded to, on Scottish politics in 2021, the United Kingdom, Brexit, and the independence movement. And this will be followed by a question-answer period for all of you. But before Euan begins, Jack Sanders is with us, and Jack is going to state the logistics surrounding our presentation today. Jack?
Thank you, Connie. Hi, everyone. This will be an hour long, as Connie said. We're going to have a Q&A portion after Euan's done with his presentation. I just want everyone to know that we are recording this. And if you have any questions during the actual presentation, you can type them into chat. It's the little button at the bottom near center right. And then once Euan is done with his presentation, you can ask your questions, and I'll ask any questions that have been typed into chat that we missed. And I think that's it. Thank you, Connie.
Well, and Euan, I'd like to have, if you don't mind, I'd like to have an interactive question answer.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't mind, and just as if we're all together. So
yeah, we just thought I got tons to say, so we thought if people thought of a question, they could put it in the chat, so they didn't have to remember it for 30 minutes until we got to the. So I'm happy to do question and answer with people, but if people want to put that question in the chat, then we know what's coming. So, because I think,
and that's all right.
And also the other thing is, I have a lot of information in a short space of time. So I'm happy. I know we're recording it, but also I'm happy to make a PDF with the slides, and I can share that with you and Jack, and you can make it available to anybody who wants it.
Thank you so much for that. Euan, we're going to give you the word. Thank you.
Okay. So quick. We're good. Everyone can see this. We have a title slide. Thumbs up. We're good. So can someone say you can see it?
We're good.
Good. Thanks, Jack. Thanks. Because I can't see, when I share my screen, I can't see people's faces or anything. So yell if it disappears. So thanks, everybody. It's always a pleasure to speak to this audience. I've done it for a few years now. As I said, I'm going to go through a lot of information very quickly to give you, I know it's a history forum, so to give you a background to the current political situation in Scotland, which I think we'll get to at the very end, because I want to sort of show how this has all developed. So although it's Scottish politics in 2021, I don't think we're going to get to 2021 for about 45 minutes. So I've got to give the background first. So as Connie said, I'm a professor of geography and I'm director of the School of Public Service at DePaul University. Most of my work on the issues of Scottish politics, I actually started my academic career writing about how the Scottish National Party projected an image of Scotland through its election TV campaigns in the early 1990s. So the issue of how people think about Scotland has always been very much an interest of mine. For those of you who don't know, I'm originally, I was born and grew up in Edinburgh and moved to the US as a student in the mid 1990s. So I've actually been here in America now longer than in Scotland, but we will move rapidly on. So obviously the critical issue in Scotland at the moment, and it has been probably for the last 20 years, is the issue of its relationship with the United Kingdom. So this is my quick table of contents. I'm going to go give you some very quick background, and then I'm really going to focus on the late 20th, early 21st century, the two referenda that happened in Scotland in 1979 and 1997, and then of course the 2014 independence referendum, then the Brexit referendum, and then at the very end we'll get to the Scottish election that just happened about a month ago, and the potential future of the United Kingdom. The question always with these is how far back should we go? This is often a point of contest, and Mark Blythe and I were talking about that in the Drammen discussion, which the link was posted in the chat. But I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of this. In 1603, you have the Scottish and English crowns merge for the first time. So we have King James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. This is the King James of the King James Bible. So we have the Union of Crowns in 1603, but the two countries are still pretty much entirely separate until 1707 with the Treaty of Union, which combines the parliaments. And I think one of the things about the Treaty of Union in 1707 is, at the time, the parliament in Scotland was not really something of any importance. It was something that the elites, the rich, the landowners, it didn't really impact everyday life. It was as much about sort of a privileged position as anything else. And so in the 1707 Treaty of Union, it unites the countries in terms of trade and in terms of the parliament, but Scotland reserved certain elements and would not share them and would not join them with England. And these were seen as arguably more important than the parliament. That was the legal system, the education system, and the Church of Scotland. And so you had, if you think about life in the early 18th century in Scotland, the role of the church and the education system were absolutely critical to people's everyday lives. And the parliament and politics was so peripheral. It was like, it was just giving away something that didn't really matter that much. So this Treaty of Union, creates the United Kingdom. And another critical thing was that this United Kingdom in 1707, although the church's remained independent, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland remained independent, they were both Protestant. And this is obviously the beginning of the Enlightenment, the beginning of, beginning of the British Empire, so to speak. And so you have this United Kingdom, which is a sort of united, progressive, for want of a better phrase, parliamentarian Protestant rule. And that's what in 1746 the Jacobites were rebelling against. And the Jacobite rebellion, again, I'm sure you're familiar with Bonnie Prince Charlie, 1745, 1746, but that effort was not really a Scottish nationalist campaign. It was more a reaction against this sort of beginning of modern Britain. And so what the Jacobites wanted to do and what their supporters wanted to do, and they had supporters in Scotland and in England, wanted to restore the kind of almost a feudal system with a Stuart Catholic monarchy. So whereas the British state that defeated the Jacobites again had Scots and English against the Jacobites, because they wanted to have a Protestant monarchy and a Protestant state. So that, although the Jacobite rebellion is often seen as a kind of last gasp resistance to unification with England, it's much more complex than that, because of these kind of dynastic and religious elements of the conflict. But obviously, with the defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746, any threat to the British state is squashed out. And so what you have for the next century or so is Scotland being very happy to be in partnership with England in the United Kingdom. You have the growth of the British Empire, you have the growth of Glasgow as an imperial city, you have the growth of Edinburgh as a center of finance and intellectual endeavors. And so there's not really a nationalist movement per se for most of the rest of the 18th and into the 19th century. The modern era really begins, though, at the end of the 19th century, and this to some extent is triggered by initially the situation in Ireland, where Ireland begins to agitate for what in the 1880s was called Home Rule. And so you begin to see throughout Scotland a desire for more what we'd call devolution, more local powers, rather than having everything go through London and Westminster. So you begin to see some home rule agitation in the 1880s, but the main political change of that era is really with the advent of the Labour Party. And the first Labour Party, of course, to the political left, and the first Labour Party leader was Keir Hardie, a Scot, and Labour were very strong in Scotland, and they really were sort of driven by this Scottish leadership. So it wasn't really Scottish nationalism, because Labour were obviously had a socialist perspective at that time, but that kind of idea for challenging the British state was not necessarily about tearing down the United Kingdom. It was about shifting it leftward. And so Labour became the party of opposition to the status quo, for want of a better phrase. The role of Labour and its power really accelerates during World War I. There's some big incidents in Glasgow during World War I. Perhaps the most famous is a rent strike led by women in Glasgow who refused to pay rent while their men were overseas fighting in World War I. And when those men come back, we see increased left-wing political pressure on the UK government, particularly from Glasgow, but also from industrial cities throughout England as well. But perhaps the most dramatic scenes were in Glasgow, where actually this photograph here, you can see in 1919, the British government moved tanks from the Western Front in France, moved tanks into Glasgow to be ready to put down what they felt was going to be a Scottish Bolshevik-style revolution, because obviously this is just after the Russian Revolution. Of course, this doesn't happen. There's a number of strikes throughout the 1920s and 30s, but the main impact in this era in the 1920s is that the Labour Party wins power in the United Kingdom, across the whole of the United Kingdom, for the first time in the 1920s. And so some of this pressure begins to dissipate. The Scottish National Party, as a formal political organization, formed in 1934. So it's not 100 years old. It's a more recent development than the Labour Party. And when the Scottish National Party forms in 1934, it's a kind of amalgamation of other nationalist groups and parties that had really had no electoral impact whatsoever. And I think the other thing is, right throughout this period, there's basically no electoral impact of the Scottish National Party whatsoever. Scotland's really divided into three main political groups: Conservatives on the political right, Labour on the political left, and then the Liberals, who become later the Liberal Democrats. But the Liberals are really kind of in the political centre, and historically had always done well in the Scottish border area. So we'll jump forward another 30 or so years into the post-World War II period. And again, at this time, there is not really a strong Scottish nationalist political movement, but one of the most famous incidents is on Christmas Day in 1950, when Scottish students stole the Stone of Destiny, which is on the British throne. You can see here in the picture on the right. The Stone of Destiny, legend had it, was the where Scottish kings were always crowned, and in the battles with between William Wallace, Robert Bruce, and King Edward, it was Edward who'd taken the Stone of Destiny to England, put it into the English throne as a way to sort of, claim rule over Scotland. Anyway, a group of students steal the Stone of Destiny, and take it back to Scotland. Eventually, it's recovered, although some people say they replaced it with a fake Stone of Destiny. It's kind of, I think sometimes it's maybe hard to tell a big chunk of stone from another big chunk of stone. But after this prank, this idea of sort of Scottish nationalism begins to enter the popular imagination. And the next big period of protest really was in 1952-53, when Scottish national activists begin to blow up mailboxes around Scotland, and they would either they would actually sort of put bombs in through the little letterbox, and the mailbox would blow up. And the reason why this is because all the mailboxes in the UK have the royal insignia on for the Royal Mail. And in 1952, Queen Elizabeth II was crowned. But of course, there'd never been a Queen Elizabeth I in Scotland. She'd only been Queen of England back in the 1500s and in the 1500s. So because there was no Queen Elizabeth I in Scotland, some Scottish nationalists made people trying to make a political point would blow up where it said ER2 Elizabeth Regina, Elizabeth II Regina. They would blow that up on the basis that there'd been no Queen Elizabeth I in Scotland. So technically, Queen Elizabeth, the current queen, should be Queen Elizabeth the second and first, second of England and the first in Scotland. So this again puts Scottish nationalism into the media, but again, it's kind of seen as a cranky minority perspective. The big breakthrough comes in the 1960s for the Scottish National Party, when really the campaign around oil, and oil was discovered off the east coast of Scotland and the North Sea in the 1960s, and the Scottish National Party begins a kind of their campaign is "It's Scotland's Oil," so really began to sort of push that. The first person elected as a member of Parliament for the Scottish National Party is Winnie Ewing, here in the top right. And it was a by-election, that's like a special election. And so it was seen as kind of a fluke, but nobody expected the Scottish National Party to do anything. And at this time, the Scottish National Party really doesn't have that coherent of a political ideology other than independence and greater devolution and self-government. It doesn't have a political left or right. Some people called them the Tartan Tories, saying they were more conservative on the right wing. And certainly in the 1970s, the argument was all about greater Scottish control over Scottish affairs and devolution of power from London. And in 1974, the United Kingdom has two national elections in the same year. In February 1974, the election results in a hung parliament. The UK-wide election, nobody gets a majority, and the Scottish National Party get 4 members of parliament. There's a second election in October 1974 where the Scottish National Party have their most successful election really until until the 21st century. They get 11 members of parliament. And in the October 1974 election, Labour has a 3-seat majority. And so what happens is the Scottish National Party say, we will, the American phrase is, we will caucus with you, we will unify with you, we'll support your agenda. So this pushes the SNP to the political left a little bit. And they'll say, we'll support Labour in return for a referendum on devolution and self-government. And so this results in the of this 1979 referendum would mean a devolved Scottish Parliament. And so the vote ends up with 1.2 million voting yes for the devolved Parliament, 1.1 million voting no. So the turnout's about 63%, which is about 64%, which is about normal for this time. But the result was no Parliament, despite the yes vote winning. And so the reason why this was that into the legislation, a Labour MP from London had instigated. Labour are in power at this time. They're in alliance with the SNP, but they devised this, what was called a 40% rule, which argued that 40% of all registered voters had to vote in favour of the referendum. So it wasn't just a simple majority, it had to be 40% of registered voters. And so when those figures were extrapolated into the numbers of registered voters, it was about 33% of registered voters who voted in favor and about 31% against. This was to establish a Scottish Parliament, not independence. And because of this 40% rule, even though the yes vote won, it did not meet this threshold. And this really led to a kind of a 1-2 blow for the Scottish National Party and to some extent for the Labour Party, because Labour had been supportive, defeated the referendum, and then within months defeat at the national level electorally when Margaret Thatcher gets elected as a Conservative Prime Minister in 1979. So what you have after 1979 is a campaign for a Scottish Assembly. So there was a whole series of documents, campaigns, meetings. Perhaps most famous, there was this kind of booklet written called A Claim of Right for Scotland, which basically argued that we need to have what we call devolution, the establishment of a local government in Scotland to run over Scottish affairs. And so this Claim of Right for Scotland was to agree a scheme for a Parliament for Scotland, mobilize Scottish opinion, and assert the right of Scottish people to secure that scheme. Most Scottish politicians signed it, as did community leaders, church leaders, labor union leaders, and so forth. But two groups are absent from this otherwise nationwide campaign. The Scottish National Party refuses to participate when independence is not discussed as an option, and the Conservatives refuse to participate as well. Now, at the time, these two are both minority perspectives. The Labour Party is largely dominant in Scotland, and so most of Scotland's political figures are in support of this Scottish Assembly. And that becomes important because most of the people who are supporting this 10 years later become the UK government. But right through the 80s and 90s, you have Margaret Thatcher and then John Major as Prime Minister. You have Margaret Thatcher's policies, which now we'd call neoliberal or right-wing policies or monetarist or free market policies. They're very unpopular in Scotland. And you can see here, these are the UK-wide election results. So in 1979, the Conservatives got 22 of the 72 members of Parliament from Scotland. 83, they got 21 of the 72 members of Parliament in Scotland. 87, they got 10 of the 72 members of Parliament, and so forth. And then a complete collapse of their vote in the late 90s into the 2000s. There was a joke in the early 2000s that there were actually more pandas in Scotland than there were Conservative members of Parliament, because there was 2 pandas in a zoo in Edinburgh and only 1 Conservative member of Parliament. So you had right through the 80s and 90s, you had the Conservatives winning UK-wide elections while losing votes in Scotland. So the other thing, Margaret Thatcher's policies lead to deindustrialization. This is part of, this was happening UK wide. Perhaps the most significant, there's a series of strikes, perhaps the most significant being the 1984-85 miners' strike, but the collapse of the Scottish steel industry, the collapse of Scottish shipbuilding, the collapse of Scottish coal mining, these other heavy industries are really seen as being Margaret Thatcher's fault and therefore the fault of the Conservatives. The other big political impact, certainly when I was growing up in Scotland, was the 1989 poll tax. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government decided that rather than instigate property taxes, they should instigate a poll tax in that everybody pays a tax. And so instead of the property owners based on the value of property, every individual would pay a tax, and it was drawn from the electoral roll. And so this had a number of impacts. And the other critical thing was she rolled that policy out in Scotland first to try it out for a year in 1989 before rolling it out UK-wide in 1990. So she tried it out in Scotland first, was met with a lot of resistance, not just because of the policy and the lack of popularity of her government in Scotland, but also what that policy implied. And then it was only when there were UK-wide protests in 1990 that actually sort of pushed her towards resignation. So you had this idea that Scotland was being deliberately victimized. That, well, whether this was true or not, but that was the impression people got. Scotland was being deliberately victimized. Its industries were being decimated. It was a test ground for new taxes and so the Conservatives became associated with a lot of these negative opinions in Scotland. And as a result, as you can see, their vote absolutely collapsed into the 2000s. You can see this a little bit here. This is seats won in the UK government by Scottish political parties, with red being Labour, blue being Conservative, orange being the Liberal or Liberal Democrats, and yellow being the Scottish National Party. You can see almost right in here in the middle, the second election in 1974, the biggest success of the Scottish National Party. But even as far as 2010, Labour was still very much the dominant political party in Scotland. Scottish National Party had a handful of seats, less than the Liberals, and the Conservative vote, as you can see, had completely collapsed, whereas, after World War II, it had been relatively popular. So even up to 10 years ago, the Scottish National Party was not, it was a political force, but it was not the major political force in Scotland that it is today. And here's just another one. Again, this shows you the votes up to 2010. Again, the Labour vote staying almost at 50%. The big one here, the collapse of the Conservative vote in blue, and then the Liberal and Scottish National Party both hovering around 20%. So you can see here in the UK elections, really the big change has been the complete collapse of the Conservative vote. But the Scottish National Party did not really make many inroads in that area. It was more Labour sustaining their dominance of the Scottish political scene. Towards the end of this period of the 1990s, we have a few events. This was a kind of last-ditch attempt by the Conservatives to placate Scottish voters and try and win back some of those votes. In 1996, this is Michael Forsyth, who formally returned the Stone of Destiny from England to Scotland. So it came back, and it's now in Edinburgh. I think it's in Edinburgh Castle. I don't remember exactly. Someone can probably post in the chat where it is. But this was a last desperate attempt by the Conservatives to show that they were engaged with the people of Scotland. And this, even though there was a big ceremony and a big march up the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, delivering the Stone of Destiny back to Edinburgh Castle, it was seen as very much a sort of a ceremony that didn't really impact people's lives. It was not the policies that people wanted. It was all about sort of just showing something rather than delivering politically. Because what people in Scotland wanted was a devolved parliament and more Scottish control over Scottish affairs. The Conservative Party is routed in the 1997 election, and then the Labour Party wins a huge majority and runs the UK for the next 13 years. Tony Blair becomes the Prime Minister on the left. Although he represented a constituency in England, he'd grown up a lot of the time and gone to high school in Edinburgh. And Gordon Brown here on the right, again, becomes Prime Minister as well after Tony Blair. Brown, long-time voice of sort of Scottish Labour politics, still very active, although he's retired, very active in the media about Scottish politics. Gordon Brown, unsuccessfully ran in the constituency I grew up in the late 1970s, when there's actually a picture, I think, of my sister and him at our local elementary school in 1979, the year when Margaret Thatcher won the election. So, but a lot of this Labour government in 1997, because Labour had been so strong in Scotland, a lot of the people in the cabinet positions had been people who'd been active in Scottish politics for a generation. They'd signed that claim of right for Scotland. And one thing Tony Blair promises is a devolution referendum. So we have, within months of Blair being elected, a devolution referendum, which was a two-question referendum. Question one was, I agree there should be a Scottish Parliament. And question two was, I agree the Scottish Parliament should have tax-varying powers, so could raise some taxes as well. And you can see here overwhelming votes in favour of both. I often joke it's one of the few times when people have voted to increase taxes on themselves, but it was an effort to, give Scotland a parliament again and give that parliament some degree of autonomy over its finances. Although there is a complex financial relationship, because the UK government sends money to Scotland for the Scottish Parliament to spend. But in the 60% turnout, there's no 40% rule, straight up yes, no. And so the Scottish referendum passes. And in 1999, after 292 years without a parliament meeting in Edinburgh, the Scottish Parliament is restored. And at this time, Labour wins the Scottish election, and they provide the leadership in the Scottish Parliament. And this is the new building. They had a lot of criticism. They obviously ran hugely over budget, but this is the Scottish Parliament. And I took a tour of it when I was back in Scotland a few years ago. I obviously, with COVID, I don't know what's happening, but it really is quite an impressive building for a legislative. Certainly looks like a much more modern legislator than your photographs of the interior of the House of Commons in London. So you have in 1999 the Labour Party leading the United Kingdom and the Labour Party leading the Scottish Parliament. So politically, these two bodies are aligned. There's not much tension between Scotland and the United Kingdom. And so the Scottish National Party, although it's present in this parliament, is certainly not the dominant power. A quick note about the Scottish parliamentary elections, which comes back to, which will come back later in the talk. In the Scottish Parliament elections, everybody gets 2 votes. So when you're electing someone to the Scottish Parliament, you get 2 votes. You get a vote for somebody in your constituency, in your district, straight up, like we'd expect here, a ward or a congressional district. You get to vote for somebody who's going to represent that geographical area. And then you get a second vote, which is called the regional list. And so you're voting in that one, you vote for a party. You vote for a party. And then the idea is that this is going to lead to a more accurate representation of how many second place votes there are to sort of make the parliament this combination of constituency MSPs, members of Scottish Parliament, and list MSPs. And so what you saw was that you'd have people split their votes. So people in Scotland began to split their votes quite tactically. And I think people in Scotland have been used to tactical voting because they tactically voted to defeat Conservatives throughout the previous 20 years. And so you had sort of people running as a single issue on a list. They would be on the list, or there'd be a small party. There was a senior citizens party, which would have no chance winning in a constituency, but on a regional list, they got enough votes to have a representative in the government, in the parliament. And the Green Party in particular has probably benefited most from this. The Green Party are unlikely to win. Green Party are left of political center, environmental conservationists and activists. They'll never win in a congressional or constituency district, but they've been very successful in picking up the regional list votes. And so the idea of this 2-vote system is a more proportional representative parliament than even the UK parliament. So in 2010, we have a split. So for the first 11 years of the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish government has been Labour and the UK government has been Labour. That shifts in 2010 when David Cameron here becomes elected UK-wide as the Conservative Prime Minister. But as you can see here from this map, the Conservatives only win one district in Scotland here in the border area. Most of Scotland remains dominated by Labour, particularly in central Scotland in the red. The orange colour is the Liberals and the yellow is the Scottish National Party. And David Cameron is very politically unpopular in Scotland. He kind of represents, much like the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, kind of represents that English, private school educated, privileged upper class. And there's a big reaction in Scotland against Cameron. And we see this happen most immediately in the Scottish elections of 2011. And this is a big breakthrough moment for the Scottish National Party. If I go back, you can just compare the maps. You can see here Scottish National Party's got maybe 5 or 6 representatives. Labour is still maybe the main dominant party, just one Conservative, but the Conservatives now rule the United Kingdom. And so people in Scotland think, well, how can Scotland's interests be best served when you've got a government in the United Kingdom that we didn't vote for in Scotland? And the reaction in the Scottish election is to vote largely for the Scottish National Party. And this is a big breakthrough. The Labour Party is much reduced in power. You can see hardly any red here. The Liberal Party becomes really peripheral, just the far northern islands of Orkney and Shetland. The Conservatives are reduced to a few areas, particularly along the border, and it becomes a Scottish National Party landslide. And the Scottish National Party, led at this time by Alex Salmond, promised a referendum in 2014. So the referendum result in 2014 was, should Scotland be an independent country? Ultimately, that fails. 1.6 million voting yes, 2.2 million voting no. But it was the largest ever electorate, the largest number of votes cast. The turnout was almost 85%, so huge turnout. Largest ever vote by mail. Of the 32 voting districts, 3 have over 90% turnout. And compared to the UK 2010 general election, which is most elections in the UK about 64-65% turnout. So just to give you an idea of some of the elements of the referendum, Scotland became politically energized. We have here the turnouts for every election, and you can see sort of hovering around the 60s to 70%, almost 85% in the 2014 referendum. But the referendum, although it's defeated, there was a number of key issues in the lead up to it. Firstly, there was a debate about what the questions should be. People really wanted a 3-choice referendum: maintain the status quo, complete independence, or what was called Devo Max, or devolution max. Basically, the return of almost all government powers to the Scottish Parliament, with very little being left in London. Basically, what would be called devolution max. But David Cameron at the time demands a clear in or out question, and the SNP agree. And so this is the ballot paper in 2014. Should Scotland be an independent country? Yes or no? Other key issues: who was eligible to vote? There was a big argument about who was eligible to vote. One of the critical things was it was deemed a local election, not a UK-wide election. So because it's a UK election, the electorate is different than in a general election. The SNP pushed for 16 and 17-year-olds to be allowed to vote. In the United Kingdom, you can leave school at 16, and the age of consent is 16. So the argument was 16-year-olds are adults, and therefore they can vote. So there was a push for 16 and 17-year-olds to get the vote. Other people, it was based on residency. So European unions and people born elsewhere in the UK who are now resident in Scotland were eligible to vote. Who was not eligible to vote was people like myself, UK citizens living outside Scotland who are eligible to vote in UK elections in Scotland. So when I can still vote in a UK election in a Scottish district, but I could not vote in this referendum. So this electorate leads to a slightly different electorate than you have in a UK parliamentary election. Key issues around the independence campaign, key political questions, EU and NATO membership. One of the big arguments was that if Scotland left the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is a member of the European Union and a member of NATO, does Scotland then simultaneously leave the EU and NATO? So that was a big issue in the campaign. And there was strong talk from countries like Spain, which has, of course, its own nationalist movements in the Basque Country in Catalonia, that Spain would block any entry of an independent Scotland into the EU. The currency issue, would Scotland keep the UK pound and therefore still be kind of tied in with the English economy? Would they adopt the euro? Would they develop their own currency? There was also a lot of debate about the, you got to remember, if you've got within the United Kingdom, things like social security, pensions, welfare are all tied up with the UK state. How would that work? And also, if you remember the 2008 housing market crash and the subsequent recession, there was a whole series of the UK government buying out Scottish banks, giving float payments to companies to try and keep them afloat. And so what would happen? Would an independent Scotland inherit those debts and have to pay London back? So there was a lot of debates about kind of the finances and the economy and the political relationships. The no side was called Better Together. It was really supported by the Labour Party. So a lot of those Labour MPs who had led the devolution campaign, people like Gordon Brown, were now kind of senior figures, were very much sort of saying, no, we need to stay as part of the United Kingdom. And so Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrats all are on the side of what they call Better Together within the United Kingdom. And you can see here making these economic arguments on that campaign. On the other side, Alex Salmond, who's now First Minister of Scotland, and I don't want to go down an Alex Salmond tangent, but he really shifted the Scottish National Party to the political left in the late 1990s and 2000s, and was First Minister of this majority SNP Scottish Parliament. He leads the Yes campaign, which is also supported by the Scottish National Party, the Green Party, and other minority parties. Don't let them tell us we can't, Scotland Futures in Scotland Hand, and so forth. This is a kind of campaign literature. You would see who do you want to decide the government of Scotland, the 5 million people in Scotland with 59 members of parliament, or kind of demonizing the southeast of England here, the 139 MPs that come from the kind of London area. Your country, your choice. It's that simple. So this, and at the time, the opinion polls were fluctuating. It was seen as almost a toss-up in 2014. It was about 50-50. This is just some scenes from the campaign in 2014. And as I mentioned, the result was a no vote. You can see here the yes vote being in blue. So the pro-independence vote being in blue, the anti-independence vote being in the pink and red. And you can sort of see the strong areas of anti-independence along the border with England in the south of Scotland and in the northeast, whereas particularly in the cities, maybe Dundee and certainly the Glasgow area as well, strong votes for yes. A couple of things when the referendum result was transpired, and I wanted to highlight a couple of things here. You can see here, yes is in blue and no is in red in the vote for independence. And in the sort of analysis afterwards, a couple of key things stood out. Younger people were hugely in favor of independence. You can see here, age 16 to 17, 71% in favor of independence. Whereas the older population, 65 plus here, much less in favor of independence, a much bigger no vote. So there was a sense of a sort of generational divide in the vote, and that's something that I think is something to bear in mind as we go through some of the other statistics I show. Here's reasons for voting. Again, yes is voting yes for independence is in blue. Voting against independence is in red. And a couple of things to point out here. A big vote, pro-independence vote based on dissatisfaction with London politics, 74%. Huge reason for why people voted for independence. European Union membership didn't have that big of an impact. You can see here, but it was one of these issues, because remember at this time, this is pre-Brexit. So most people in Scotland at this time are concerned that if they leave the UK, they leave the EU. And again, here, again, I'm going to read these 3 reasons why people voted no. What was the most important reason? And you can see here, the risk of being independent looked too great when it came to things like currency, EU membership, the economy, jobs, and so forth. So again, these economic arguments really drove the no vote. The attachment to the United Kingdom, not so much. It was very much this kind of idea of the economy, currency, EU membership were critical. So after the referendum, Salmond resigns and Nicola Sturgeon becomes the SNP leader and the First Minister of Scotland. And the other thing we see after the referendum is the beneficiaries of the defeat are the defeated organisation. The Scottish National Party membership triples. They gain 66,000 new members. Their polling goes above 50%. Remember, this is an organisation that 15 years previously had, maximum of 20% of the vote and a couple of members of parliament. They're now polling at over 50% in the UK in the multi-party system. And Nicola Sturgeon says where in the 2015 UK election, something material would have to change in terms of the circumstances of public opinion before I think it's appropriate to have a proposal for a second referendum. So in the UK election of 2015, where David Cameron is really facing an English challenge from UKIP and other and the anti-European Union groups within his own party, the SNP has unprecedented success. David Cameron still wins the UK election, but the Scottish National Party wins 56 of 59 seats in the UK election. It's stunning. I mean, the size of the SNP win in 2015 was just unprecedented. So you have a very clear divide. Conservative rule in the United Kingdom based on English votes, Scottish National Party representing Scotland. And the key loser in all this is the Labour Party, which until 2000 had dominated Scotland for 100 years. So to fend off his political right, to push back against the right wing of his own party, David Cameron calls the infamous 2016 Brexit referendum. Here's the Brexit result. You can see here Scotland strongly votes for Remain. 2/3 of the population pretty much votes for Remain. But the number of English votes, 50 million votes for Leave, kind of tips the balance. And you can see here Scotland unanimously votes to remain in the European Union. And remember, one of the things that had made people vote against independence in 2014 was kind of fear of an independent Scotland leaving the European Union and not being readmitted. And now the situation has changed where English votes have taken Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland as well. You can see here voted to remain in the European Union. But it's primarily the 15 million English votes that are taking Scotland out of the EU. And so you also see this map is side by side in the David Cameron resigns, Theresa May becomes Prime Minister, calls the UK-wide election. So this on the left is a 2015 UK election with the SNP winning 56 of 59 seats. This little red dot is where my parents lived, the one Labour member of Parliament left in Scotland. One of the critical things here then, if you remember, we go back to the maps I showed you earlier, even just from 5 years earlier, Labour, this map was half red. Now there's no Labour Party anywhere, hardly any Conservatives. What we see after Brexit referendum, Brexit is 2016, 2017 UK election, the Conservatives become the voice. So the Scottish politics at this time becomes almost a two-party system. The Conservatives being in favour of remaining in the United Kingdom, the Scottish National Party saying independence from the UK and readmit into the EU. So it really becomes a two sides of the constitutional argument. So the Conservatives actually do much better than expected in 2017, picking up a number of seats across, particularly in the northeast, where fishing and farming are important, and the Brexit is imagined to enhance British farming and fishing policy, and then along the border with England. Then most recently, 2019, a couple of years ago, Boris Johnson, again, if you had to paint a caricature of the kind of wealthy English upper class person who people in Scotland despise, it would look a lot like Boris Johnson. He becomes the Conservative Party leader and the Conservative Party Prime Minister. He says in the campaign in 2019 that the 2014 referendum was a once in a generation vote and Scotland should not have another referendum. You can see as a result in the 2019 election, again, some of those Conservative gains are lost, and the SNP, although it's not got the kind of sweeping the board as happened in 2015, has certainly the major power. Again, one Labour MP, same person representing the district where I grew up in Edinburgh. So the Scottish National Party, winning 48 of 59 seats in the UK-wide election, is the dominant voice in Scottish politics. So let's come to 2021 and the campaign that has just finished. The Scottish National Party, they promised in their manifesto to hold what's the second independence referendum, what people call Indy Ref 2. They promise that if they win a majority, they will hold Indy Ref 2 and rejoin the European Union as soon as possible. Because, of course, the UK, Brexit, the UK is now out of the EU. They're going to build more affordable housing, remove nuclear weapons, emphasize green jobs. Decarbon, should be decarbonize, typo, sorry about that one, decarbonize, go to a carbon neutral, remove environmentally friendly policy. They offer free bikes for children, free bus rides for people under 22 years old, increase spending on health service by 20%. So this is very much a left of center progressive agenda. The SNP is one of the few left-wing nationalist parties in the world. This is the Scottish parliamentary elections, and you can see here, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. This is the Scottish parliamentary elections running up to now, and again, you have the red is the collapse of the Labour vote, the yellow is the increase of the Scottish National Party, with the Conservatives in blue and the Liberals in orange. So the Liberal vote has really collapsed. The Greens are allies of the Scottish National Party. And so you can sort of see the SNP really has dominated Scottish elections for the last decade. So this is the most recent election results. I have a couple of slides left. I appreciate your patience. This is the results from a couple of weeks ago. Turnout is about 64%, so back on what we kind of expect. On the left-hand side are the constituency votes. So you can see here the Conservatives remain strong along the border with England. The SNP pretty much wipes the floor with all other political parties. You have some local, some of these Liberal Party successes in the northern Shetland and Orkney Islands and so forth are due to the individual representatives who are quite popular. Very small vote for Labour. Labour has really lost all ground. And then on the right-hand side, what you have is these second votes, these region votes. As you can see here, this is where the Conservatives picked up a lot of their MPs, and Labour as well, MSPs, with these regional votes. The final result is that the SNP end up with 62 constituency votes and 2 regional votes, which means they have 64 members of Scottish Parliament, which is one short of you need 65 for a majority. So they have 64, they're one short of majority, but they caucus with the Green Party. The Green Party is their allies. And so the 8 Green Party, and the Green Party is pro-independence, the 8 Green Party MSPs will join the 64 Scottish National Party to make a make a my math 72 seat majority. So they have the majority, and so there's in the Scottish Parliament right now, the majority is pro-independence. The other thing is the 2021 results is the most diverse Scottish Parliament ever. 58 of the 129 MSPs are women. We have 6 members from ethnic minority groups from across the political spectrum. The first permanent wheelchair user in the Parliament as well. So a lot of people in relation to the Scottish Parliament feel that it genuinely is representative of the population of Scotland in the way that the UK Parliament isn't. And we have a current situation, therefore, of a majority of pro-independence MSPs, but the issue is always the opinion polls. And here's you can see here, this is pretty much up to date on opinion polling. And this is, should Scotland be an independent country? You can see here on these opinion polls, yes is green, no is red, and you can just see where we are right now on the far right-hand side. It's very, very blurred. It's basically neck and neck in the well within margins of error. And so the general thought is that the SNP will wait until yes gets up to nearer 60% before they'll call the referendum, because they won't want to lose a second time. However, it's not as easy as calling a referendum. Firstly, any referendum would need approval from the Westminster government in London. It's called a so-called Section 30 order, which would basically, the Scottish Parliament would have to make a request to the United Kingdom government to hold a binding referendum to amend the article that the legislation that governs the current Scottish Parliament, which is called the Scotland Act of 1998. So we're in this strange situation where Scotland has to ask the United Kingdom for permission to hold a referendum. Boris Johnson has currently said he would not grant permission to hold a referendum, and the Scottish National Party said that if that's the case, they would take this to the UK Supreme Court to assess the power of the Scottish government in relation to the UK government through the auspices of this 1998 Scotland Act. So this is where we are now. What's next? The Scottish National Party promised a second referendum would be held within the first half of the 5-year parliamentary term, which would be 2023-24. However, they also said they're now going to concentrate on recovery from COVID, so they could push back that date in a way that's not politically damaging to them, because obviously, as we all know, the pandemic has suddenly changed a lot of things about what are priorities. After seeing the Scottish National Party and the Green Party claim victory earlier this month, Boris Johnson said that an independence referendum would be irresponsible and reckless. So the Conservatives still opposing an independence referendum. Polls suggest that 70 to 80% of people aged 17 to 34 are pro-independence. So again, younger people tend to be much more pro-independence. The question is that generation of pro-independence, is it youthful enthusiasm, or is it a fundamental change in Scottish politics? I think the other thing, which I forgot to mention, and I apologize, this is my last slide, is that one of the other big talking points in the last year has been all the authority that was in Brussels as part of EU legislation. All the stuff that the UK had to defer to the EU has now been obviously returned to the UK. And one of the debates has been, should those powers be returned to London, or should they be given to the Scottish Assembly, the Welsh Assembly, and the Northern Irish Assembly? And Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have consolidated a lot of I don't know any specific examples, but the general understanding is that Boris Johnson has absorbed and centralized a lot of those returning powers, again, much to the chagrin of people who are pro-devolution and pro-independence. So there's a sort of sense, and there's a number of reports came out around about a month ago, and I'm happy to, I'll send the links to Connie and Jack, and she can distribute them. But a lot of the reports have sort of shown that conservatives in England, not in Scotland, conservatives in England have soured on devolution because it's seen as creating the conditions for the dissolution of the United Kingdom. And so the conservatives have become, the ruling conservatives in London have become, even in this pandemic era, kind of antagonistic towards some Scottish policies. And I think one of the things that's happened in Scotland, particularly with the pandemic response, is you've seen a clear divergence between Scotland and England. People have recognized Nicola Sturgeon's leadership as being more comprehensive than Boris Johnson's, although the power of the UK state to administer vaccines has been seen as a positive for the United Kingdom as a whole. That wouldn't have happened if Scotland had been independent, because the European Union's distribution of vaccines has been less successful. So there's all these political angles. The debate is ongoing. I think the question is, does this generation of people who are aged 17 to 34, who are strongly pro-SNP and strongly pro-independence, will they be as strongly pro-independence and pro-SNP when they're aged 35 to 54? And if they are, then I think we'll see certainly a fundamental change in the political construction of the British Isles. So I will end it there, and I'm happy to have a conversation, and I will correct that typo. Sorry about that one. So, Jack, can you handle the question and answer, please?
Yes, thank you. It looks like we don't have any questions in chat right now.
Okay, we have the Stone of Destiny is displayed in Edinburgh Castle and will only leave Scotland again for coronations in Westminster Abbey.
Raise hand. Here we go. There we go.
I'd like to open the floor now for our question and answer period. And I know you're not shy, so what are your questions for Euan, or commentary, please?
Yeah, there's a question that Bob and Louise have their little hand raised on the function.
Yeah, I want to thank you for an incredibly beautiful explanation. I mean, that is just magnificent. Thank you very much.
Oh.
I'm overwhelmed. And, you know, there's so much in that. I mean, you know, we could probably take every 3 minutes of it and do another hour on it. It's just unbelievable what you condensed in 1 hour here. But one thing that really fascinated me was the voting system itself. And I'm wondering, can I correctly assume that there's a similarity between the Scottish two-vote system and our system of voting for senators and representatives?
It's not quite the same, because the senators in the Scottish Parliament, they all meet. They're not two separate. There's not like a Senate and a House of Representatives. They're all in the same body, and they're given equal status and equal term lengths. So they're all, it's like one great big House of Representatives. So you don't have that bicameral element. Now, of course, in the United States, technically, you could split your vote, right? You could vote for one senator from one party and one representative from another party. Although I think that's a lot less common in the US than it is in Scotland. I think, you know, in the US, people tend to go down ticket. The two-party system has basically meant people go down ticket. Whereas in Scotland, because you have basically 5 active parties, people have been used to long time to splitting tickets and to tactically voting. So you actually had one reason people think the Conservative vote has gone up is from a lot of old Labour Party voters who kind of or Liberal voters who are holding their nose and voting Conservative, because Conservative are the strongest pro-UK voice in Scottish politics. There's a lot of Labour is pro-UK, but they're not seen as being quite the staunch defenders of it that the Conservatives are. So there's some thoughts that tactical voting has meant that people, as I say, people who for all their lives have voted politically center or center left, liberal or Labour, are kind of holding their nose and voting Conservative because that's seen as a way to stop the Scottish National Party.
Thank you.
There's a question from George and then Alfred.
Yes. As far as you were talking about the powers that were taken away from the EU and were now seem to be have been appropriated by the Westminster government. I don't know that you mentioned the internal market bill, which has driven the Scots nuts because it seems like the provisions of the internal market bill could take away Scottish law, could take away education, whatever Westminster decides. They have the right to do what they jolly well please.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point, George. And as Bob mentioned, we could do an hour on each one of these slides. But this legislation that the Conservative government put forward, and George is quite correct, called the Internal Market Bill, is an attempt to reshape intra-UK trade between Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland post-Brexit. And it is very much based on English law, and which is different than Scottish law, as I already mentioned. And it kind of centralizes a lot of power through the UK government. It's been particularly attacked, it also violates, as many of you will have read in the media, the peace agreement in Northern Ireland. And so it's hugely problematic. And I don't know if it's even been, I don't know the extent to which it's been resolved or renegotiated. I'd have to look that up. But I think you're right. This kind of post-Brexit trade and political landscape, a lot of people are feeling that the devolved parliaments aren't being consulted. They're hearing about it on the TV when the rest of the people are, rather than being involved in the active discussion of what a post-Brexit UK state would look like. Alfred's question was next. I want to make sure I don't miss any questions, George. Sorry for jumping in, but Alfred's question was next.
My question is, Boris has two problems, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Which one's going to blow up first?
Well, it's literally or figurative. Northern Ireland is such a different situation. You've probably seen in the news, there's been a lot of trouble there already this spring. We're seeing for the first time in the UK elections in 2019, for the first time ever, pro-reunification votes were more than pro-UK votes in Northern Ireland for the first time in history. Now, I think that, I say, is such a different situation, but I think that is, and because of the history of Northern Ireland, I think Scotland definitely is committed to change through the ballot box and doing things with political legitimacy. Given the history in Ireland, I just don't want to make a prediction, but I do. You're right. I think the thing that Boris Johnson did in Northern Ireland, and again, I don't know all the details, but he sold out his allies. His allies in Northern Ireland were the politicians who were really quite conservative and favored strong unification with the United Kingdom. And Johnson promised that the Democratic Unionist Party, as I know, he promised them all these great things post-Brexit, and then basically went back on the whole deal to get his Brexit agreement through. So he undercut his main allies in Ireland. As a result, that political group in Ireland that were very strong conservative supporters of the United Kingdom feel very disillusioned. Their leader resigned. They're in disarray. And Johnson has lit a touch paper there, and I don't know what the resolution is going to be.
Thank you.
George, your hand is up again. Is that the same hand as last time, or is it a new question?
No, that's a new one. One thing is that no matter how many SNP MPs there are, their voices almost nothing, because you've got an absolute majority of the Conservative Party
Yep.
in the UK Parliament,
Mhm.
and so it's like Boris can do whatever he pleases, and that's almost like in the case of the United States, well, as before the War of Independence, that we have had taxation without representation. Well, the Scots have representation, but it's irrelevant.
Right, and I think that's critical. You're right. That's a critical issue, and that's been the case really since the late 1970s.
Yeah, but there's more to it to that, and that is that I don't know. I'm not even sure that the majority of the English people or the majority of the UK are in favor of the Conservatives. That I think it's because of the UK voting system that it's all the first past the post got in, and so it's not representative of the way people actually voted. The Scottish system is a whole lot more complex, but it does represent. It does. The other parties do get represented.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, George, and that's of course the Conservatives have a very clear policy agenda. You know, Brexit, maintain the union, these trade treaties. They're not as conservative in terms of cultural elements. That they don't have the battles that we have with the Republicans and Democrats here in the United States. It's very much a sort of economic and driven agenda, but because they're against 3 or 4 other parties, depending on where they're running, they can win seats with 35-40% of the vote, because the opposition vote is split between 3 or 4 other opponents. And so you're absolutely right. They might not have a majority of votes UK-wide, but with the first past the post system, also they've very much become kind of a voice of English nationalism, although I don't think they necessarily would say that. They're popular enough in England to have a louder voice than kind of all the opponents put together. Connie had a question.
And I was surprised when you mentioned that Spain, going back to the 2014 referendum, that Spain planned to block Scotland's entry to the European Union. And I'm wondering, can you tell us why Spain was opposed to an independent Scotland joining the European Union? I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on that and whether they would still be opposed now or not.
So this is obviously, I haven't interviewed any Spanish politicians or diplomats, right? This was how it was reported. But basically, remember in the 2014, Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, which is part of the European Union. And so if Scotland becomes independent, do they get to remain in the European Union? They're already a member. Are they leaving the EU when they leave the UK, or are they still a member when they're part of the UK? Now in Spain, you have the Basque nationalists and the Catalan nationalists. So Catalonia and the Basque Country, regions of Spain, have long had these nationalist agendas as well. And so Spain feels that if Scotland can leave the UK and still be in the EU, well, there's a precedent set then for the Basque Country or for Catalonia, the area around Barcelona, to leave Spain but stay in the EU. And so one of the arguments was, if Scotland leaves the UK, it would be out of the EU and it would have to apply to join again, because if it became automatically part of the EU, because it would still have all EU regulations and everything, because nothing would have changed, overnight, other than the political status in relation to the UK. So the real feeling was that Spain did not want to set a precedent that could then lead to the fragmentation of Spain along the nationalist lines within that country.
I got it.
So that's what's different is the UK has left the EU, right? So the UK is out of the EU now. So Scotland would be coming back in if it becomes independent. And I think Spain would be more receptive to that, because Spain hasn't left the EU right? Spain is still in to be welcoming in an independent country. So I think because of Brexit, the political calculations, I think Scotland would have support from other European Union countries, because I think London is seen, the EU has seen London-led politics as betraying the EU project. And I think the EU is going to say, well, if London-led politics has betrayed the EU project, but Scotland wants out of that and back into the EU, I think Scotland would be well received, as long as it meets the various economic conditions that the EU has in place. So the question was, would Scotland get to jump the queue and rejoin the EU straight away as independent? And I think there may be a waiting period for political effect, but I think Scotland would have support throughout Europe. The other status would be something like Norway. Norway is not in the EU, but it has a number of trading agreements with EU countries. And so the other thing would be, if Scotland's not admitted back into the EU, could it at least generate the similar status to Norway and having these kind of multilateral economic trade agreements, which are less Brexity than Brexit, if that is a sentence.
And why hasn't Norway been fully admitted?
Norway hasn't wanted to join.
Oh. So
Norway has always, I don't know Norwegian politics, but basically Norway with an independent country, as an independent non-EU country with its own laws on fishing and oil. If you think, a lot of Norway's wealth comes from offshore, if you just think of what Norway's like. And so Norway, to the best of my knowledge, when other Scandinavian countries were joining in the 70s, like Denmark and Sweden, Norway decided not to, because it wanted to maintain its independent governance over fishing, farming, and rights to maritime rights. And so a lot of people in Scotland, if you look at that northeast of Scotland, which is still voting Conservative, they're looking at the kind of maritime rights of North Sea oil and fishing and to some, obviously farming is not maritime, but those kind of rights, which are seen, Brexit promised would enhance wealth for fisheries and farming. Whether that's actually happening, though, has been there's been a lot of challenges saying it's not really happening at the moment. There's been a lot of red tape. We have a couple last questions, and then we're well over time. So we have, I think, Gus, you have a question or something to add?
Hi, can you hear me? Did I switch the microphone okay? Yeah. Connie, you had a question first. I'm happy for you to ask it if you prefer.
I did.
She just did.
Okay. Euan, thank you very much. It's not really a question, but I can feel that I'm going to have to go and attend to the young'uns shortly. And I wanted to make sure that I thanked you and everybody for attending. And encourage you to attend a couple of other events that are coming up this week. And Jack is just going to post it in the chat. We have an online look at the Mars exploration rover that was manufactured, the wheels of which were manufactured by Scott Forge, one of our most important supporters through the years, is a man whose name literally is on the building at the Scottish home, the Georgeson family. His company, Scott Forge, is one of the world's largest forging companies, and they were commissioned to develop and manufacture the wheels for the Mars rover. So we'll be having a presentation from their engineers and also looking at Scotland's space technology industries. Somebody from the Space Council of Scotland, I think it's called, is going to be speaking. And we're also going to look with an ex-player, an ex-football player called Jamie Smith, who played for Celtic and now is here in the States working in Nashville. He's a former Scottish international footballer. He and Rory Hederley and Murray Findlay will be having a chat about Scotland's chances in the Euro Championships coming up next weekend. So Jack's posted both of those in the chat room. Euan, one final question then, perhaps, if I could. There was an article in The Guardian this week about what Scotland's, what the discussion national and Scottish independence and identity around that means outside of Scotland, particularly for England. You know, they talked about nationalism in Ireland and Wales and in Scotland as you have today. But, you know, England has a place in all of this, and what of English nationalism and identity?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a critical question. I think for a long time, and I think for anybody who's from Scotland, the equation of the United Kingdom with England always kind of grates a little bit. I find myself correcting my students all the time when they put the United Kingdom or they show the UK flag as England's flag or something. I was even on my phone the other day and I was texting a friend, do you want to watch the Scotland versus England game? And he gave me the option of a Union Jack when I started writing England. So even my phone seems to have that kind of conflation. So I do think one of the things that has come out of this is I think you've got a generation in Scotland that are very engaged about politically and culturally about what it means to be Scottish, without a doubt. And that question has been at the forefront for probably most of my lifetime. You know, I think that's become very clear. Ireland, obviously, as I mentioned earlier to Alfred's question, very different set of issues around identity. But I think people in Ireland are very clear about where they fit on the identity spectrums in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. Wales, to some extent, obviously the strength of the Welsh language in the north and west of the country. Wales, the identity issues are maybe tied up slightly differently. I don't know them in much detail. But the issue in this conflation of England and the United Kingdom has meant quite often that Englishness has never been examined. And one of the things that we've sort of seen is the Conservatives and certainly UKIP. I mean, I should point out here, Nigel Farage has next to no political power in the United Kingdom. I know he's kind of seen in the United States as having this kind of, you know, strong voice, but he has pretty much no, he's got the threat of power. He keeps threatening to unleash his supporters, but when it comes to hard votes, he never quite has crossed into any kind of political in political power. But that kind of Englishness, that kind of I don't know if it's nostalgic or stereotypical Englishness, England has never really reckoned with its identity in quite the same way that Scotland has. So I do think one of the biggest questions going forwards is what is post-Brexit Englishness going to look like and how that's going to be different than post-Brexit Scottish. You go to Scotland now, and a number of you, I do hope you get the opportunity to travel there. I've obviously not been back for 18 months. We're looking forward to hopefully visiting my parents or my kids' grandparents. You know, we're hoping to go over by the end of the year. But Scotland does feel different than England. I don't quite know what it is. And I think there was this, I think the other, something I didn't mention that kind of answered Gus's question, the 2012 Olympics in England, in London, the 2012 Olympics in London had this opening ceremony that celebrated a vision of modern Britishness. And it had everything from nurses to James Bond, but it was very clearly multicultural, multinational. It was a vision of the modern British state. Go back if you have time on your hands, because we're, you know, before we can get visiting our friends and relatives again, the opening ceremony, it was directed by a guy called Danny Boyle, who's an English director, but his most famous movie is Trainspotting, which was set in Scotland in the 1990s. So it was very much this vision of this multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural Britain. What the Conservatives and Brexit have done is really been fighting against that vision, I think, for the last decade. Brexit has kind of tried to put that vision of a multi-ethnic, diverse country back in a bottle, and you sort of see this go it alone, England will rule the waves type of rule Britannia stuff, which is very 19th century. So I do think the issue of Englishness needs to be reckoned with in a way that I think Scotland is pretty comfortable with its multiracial, multicultural identity. Be it you have a situation where the Conservatives in Scotland quite often don't want to be associated with the Conservatives in England. Now, Boris Johnson did not come to Scotland to campaign for local Conservatives in Scotland because the local Conservatives in Scotland thought that Boris Johnson's presence would lose them votes. So you actually have the situation where the Conservatives in Scotland, in many instances, would prefer to be not affiliated with the Conservatives in England because they actually feel, because people in Scotland, there's plenty of people in Scotland who like conservative economic policy, right? That there's plenty of people in Scotland who like that policy. And those conservative Scottish members of parliament want to be able to advocate that perspective without the baggage of this Englishness and Boris Johnson's UK government. So I think you've got this really interesting tension. You could actually argue that an independent Scotland would be better for the Conservatives because they would always win in England and they'd be able to generate their own right of centre political identity in Scotland without the baggage of England. So I've often thought that a Conservative policy would make, to break up the United Kingdom would make sense for the Conservatives in the political short term. But of course, that goes against the underlying basis of their party, is that they're a United Kingdom-wide party. And the group that's really squeezing all this is the Labour voters. That's really the party that is now without a clear voice, without a clear identity, and he's having to negotiate this kind of English-driven Brexit where they've lost a lot of their votes to the Conservatives, and this Scottish National Party strength in Scotland where Labour again has been wiped out. So I think interesting political times. We'll do this again in 5 years.
All right. One. This is the 175th anniversary of the Chicago Scots, and you're a member of the board, so I appreciate your leadership and your commitment to the organization very much. And a question that we're asking everyone during our 175th anniversary is, what does Scottish identity mean to you? You've mentioned the notion of what it means to be Scottish a couple of times. And if I could, as a final question, ask you what your own Scottish identity means to you.
Oh, goodness. I think it's always, I don't know. I mean, it's a sort of about, I believe I would say that the thing I've taken away from it most in almost 50 years, is being able to have, you have one foot in, you have a foot inside and a foot outside all the time. It's this typical, what the famous Scottish political theorist Tom Nairn would say. Tom Nairn would say, the Janus-faced of Scotland. You're simultaneously looking forwards and backwards. You're on your I don't say it's your identity, but your character is two-faced, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But your character is looking inwards and outwards all the time. You know, and I think it's looking outwards internationally and looking inwards to Scotland in a way that I feel sometimes Britain, but certainly sometimes England, is much more insular. I think Scottish identity has always given me a sense of being the same but different, being inside and outside, being able to see things from slightly different angles, being able to understand that one voice doesn't speak for everybody. I think that also is a lesson, as I've shown politically today, has also been a lesson. So people say the Scottish character, there's this thing called I can't even spell it, but it's the Scottish anti-zygny. It's like ANTISZY, I can't spell it, but it's this idea of the Scottish character being a combination of opposites wrapped in one person. The most famous example being Jekyll and Hyde. And I think that's very much this, without obviously the murdering, but this idea of being two in one, being able to see both sides of an issue, being both perspectives, and sort of getting the benefits of both worlds, I think, but always being able to see that little different perspective that coming from Scotland, you sort of see things as coming from Scotland and living internationally, I think gives you that multiple perspective. And Scots have always been great travelers, as all of you know. And I think that's something that is part of it.
Thank you, Euan. Brilliant answer. Connie.
Well, Euan, I just can't thank you enough. We can't thank you enough for being with us today. And really, what a fascinating talk. And we're definitely going to follow up, because we'd love to have you come back and do another discussion of Scottish politics in the future. So rest assured, I'll be in touch with you about that. I'd also like to thank Jack Sanders, who's joined the History Forum and is providing technology expertise. And Jack, thank you so much for facilitating and recording these Zoom meetings for posterity. Of course, Gus, our leader, we can't thank you enough for being here. It's delightful to see you and everyone today. And friends, I hope you will join in next month on July 3rd for a very special presentation live from Stirling, Scotland, when Dr. Alistair Mann, senior lecturer at the University of Stirling Department of History, is going to be speaking to us on King James II and the Seventh, the Forgotten Jacobite. So same time, same station. We'll see you then. And I would like to go ahead and bring the formal part of our meeting to adjournment, but I would like to welcome anyone who would like to stay on and chat informally to do so.